Cannes, May 1982. The Grand Palais was hosting the most exclusive evening in cinema, the 35th Cannes Film Festival's closing ceremony and awards gala. 300 of the most powerful figures in international filmmaking had gathered in their finest evening wear, representing in every major studio, every significant talent agency, and every important film market in the world. Michael Caine sat at table 15, enjoying what should have been a celebration of cinematic achievement, completely unaware that he was about to become the target of one of the most vicious public attacks in film festival history. Because when Robert De Niro decided to use his Lifetime Achievement presentation to launch a devastating assault on Michael's credibility as an actor, he had no idea that Michael's calm, surgical response would not only destroy De Niro's reputation, but force the greatest method actor of his generation to literally fall to his knees and beg for forgiveness in front of the entire international film community. The Cannes Film Festival in 1982 represented the absolute pinnacle of global cinema culture. This wasn't just another industry gathering, it's where artistic reputations were made and destroyed, where careers were launched or ended, where the future of filmmaking was debated and decided by people who controlled hundreds of millions of dollars and influenced the tastes of audiences worldwide. Robert De Niro was being honored that evening with a special Lifetime Achievement Award for his revolutionary contribution to cinema. At 38, he was already considered one of the greatest actors in film history, having redefined what screen acting could be through his intense method approach and his transformative performances in films like Taxi Driver, The Godfather Part II, and Raging Bull. De Niro represented the new wave of American cinema, serious, uncompromising, dedicated to artistic truth above commercial considerations. He was known for his fanatical preparation, his complete immersion in characters, and his contempt for actors who he believed were more concerned with fame than with the craft of acting. Michael Caine represented everything that De Niro despised about the film industry. Where De Niro spent months preparing for roles, transforming his body and psyche to become his characters, Michael worked with apparent effortlessness, bringing his natural charisma and intelligence to roles without the visible suffering that De Niro considered essential to serious acting. Where De Niro chose projects based primarily on artistic merit and the opportunity to explore complex characters, Michael had built his career on a mixture of commercial entertainment and serious drama, always maintaining a sense of professionalism and reliability that made him valuable to studios and audiences alike. To De Niro's way of thinking, Michael Caine wasn't a real actor. He was a movie star who had learned to deliver competent performances without ever truly understanding what acting was supposed to be. The two men had never worked together, but their contrasting approaches to the craft had made them natural representatives of two different philosophies of acting. Industry insiders often debated which approach was more valid, De Niro's intense method work or Michael's natural, intuitive style. The evening had proceeded beautifully through dinner and the early presentations. Awards had been given for various categories. Touching speeches had been delivered by festival organizers, and the assembled guests were enjoying the glamorous atmosphere of international cinema at its most prestigious. When festival director Gil Jacob rose to introduce De Niro for his Lifetime Achievement Award, the anticipation in the room was enormous. Everyone understood they were about to hear from one of the most important actors of his generation, and expectations were high for insights into the craft and perhaps some memorable reflections on the state of cinema. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jacob announced in both French and English, "it is my extraordinary honor to present our Lifetime Achievement Award to an actor whose revolutionary approach to his craft has transformed not just American cinema, but the very understanding of what it means to create authentic human truth on screen. Robert De Niro." The standing ovation was immediate and thunderous. 300 of the most successful people in international filmmaking rose to their feet, applauding the man who had redefined screen acting for their generation. De Niro walked to the podium with the controlled intensity that characterized all his public appearances. For the first 15 minutes, his speech was everything the audience had hoped for. He spoke about the responsibility that came with the power to reach millions of people through cinema, and the importance of using that power to explore genuine human emotions and experiences. But then his tone began to change. However, De Niro said, his voice taking on the harder edge that audiences recognized from his most intense performances, "I must express my concern about certain trends I see in our industry today." The audience settled back. sensing that they were about to hear something more controversial than the usual acceptance speech platitudes. We are living in an era where surface has begun to triumph over substance, where charm and likability are valued more than emotional truth, where actors have become celebrities rather than artists. Several people in the audience exchanged glances. This was starting to sound like a direct attack rather than general commentary. I see actors today who have achieved enormous success and international recognition without ever bothering to understand what acting actually requires. They show up, they deliver adequate performances with natural charm, and they become famous for being charming rather than for being truthful. The room was growing tense. Everyone could sense that De Niro was building towards something specific. These actors, De Niro continued, his voice growing stronger and more pointed, are not artists. They are not craftsmen. They are personalities who have learned to project likability on screen without ever accessing the deeper emotional truths that real acting demands. Michael felt a familiar cold sensation in his stomach. Something about De Niro's tone and the direction of his comments suggested this wasn't going to remain abstract much longer. And perhaps the most troubling example of this triumph of personality over artistry, De Niro said, his eyes scanning the room before settling directly on Michael's table, is sitting right here in this room tonight. The silence was absolute. 300 of the most powerful people in international cinema understood they were about to witness something unprecedented. Michael Caine, De Niro said, his voice carrying the same intensity he brought to his most memorable screen moments, has built an entire career on being charming. He has never, not once in 30 years of making films, delivered a performance that showed any understanding of what acting actually is. The audience was frozen. This kind of direct personal attack was unheard of at such a prestigious event, especially coming from someone receiving an honor. Michael Caine is a fraud, De Niro continued, clearly relishing the shocked attention of his audience. He has convinced audiences and critics that natural charm and professional competence constitute acting, when in reality he has never accessed genuine emotion, never transformed himself into a character, never shown any evidence of understanding what it means to create truth on screen. Michael sat perfectly still, his face calm but his mind calculating rapidly. Around him, his tablemates looked mortified. Festival organizers were whispering urgently to each other, unsure whether to intervene. Michael represents everything that is corrupting our art form, De Niro pressed on, warming to his theme. He is the triumph of surface over depth, of commerce over art, of English politeness over American emotional truth. De Niro paused for dramatic effect, enjoying the complete attention of the room and the power of the moment. He is, quite simply, a fraud who has fooled the industry into believing that being pleasant and professional is the same thing as being talented. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the Grand Palais was staring at Michael, waiting to see how he would respond to this devastating public humiliation. Michael stood up slowly, adjusting his dinner jacket with characteristic precision. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly through the hall's perfect acoustics. "Robert," he said, his tone conversational and almost friendly, "that's a fascinating analysis of my career. I'd like to share some thoughts about yours, if the festival directors don't mind." De Niro looked surprised. He'd expected anger, embarrassment, or stunned silence. He hadn't anticipated this calm, measured response. Festival director Jacob, clearly flustered by the unprecedented situation, gestured uncertainly. "Of course, Mr. Caine, if you wish to respond." Michael began walking toward the stage, his pace unhurried but purposeful. As he moved, he spoke in that clear, intelligent voice that had made him one of the most respected actors of his generation. "You've built your reputation on being a serious artist, Robert. Someone who sacrifices everything for emotional truth and authentic character creation, and you've achieved remarkable things with that approach. Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, The Godfather Part 2, these are genuinely great performances." The audience was riveted. This wasn't the angry confrontation they'd expected. "But I think it's interesting that you've chosen tonight to lecture this room about artistic integrity and authentic emotion, because it raises some questions about your own recent work and methods." Michael had reached the stage now and was standing beside De Niro, who was looking significantly less confident than he had moments earlier. "For instance," Michael continued, his voice still calm and conversational, How do we reconcile your passionate defense of method acting and emotional truth with your decision to spend 6 months gaining 60 pounds to play Jake LaMotta, and then another 6 months losing it, putting yourself through physical torture that had nothing to do with understanding the character and everything to do with creating a spectacle? The comment hit the room like a physical blow. De Niro's extreme physical transformation for Raging Bull had been widely praised, but Michael was reframing it as self-indulgent exhibitionism. Your preparation for that role was certainly impressive, Michael continued. But was it actually acting, or was it an athlete's training regimen designed to convince audiences and critics that suffering equals artistry? De Niro's face was reddening, but Michael wasn't finished. Or perhaps we could discuss your approach to collaboration and professionalism. You've spoken eloquently tonight about the sacred nature of the acting process, but I'm curious about how that squares with your habit of demanding multiple takes until everyone around you is exhausted, not because you're discovering something new about the character, but because you're indulging your own perfectionism. The audience was stunned. These were criticisms that people whispered privately, but no one had ever voiced publicly. I've spoken to directors who've worked with you, Robert. Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, Michael Cimino. They tell fascinating stories about your methods, how you refuse to break character between takes, forcing everyone else to interact with your performance rather than with you as a person. Michael's voice remained calm, but his words were surgical in their precision. How you demand endless rehearsal time, endless script revisions, endless accommodation of your process, regardless of the cost or the inconvenience to everyone else involved in the production. The mention of specific directors sent another shock through the room. This wasn't just Michael's opinion. He was citing the people De Niro had worked with most closely, and I think my favorite example comes from the filming of The Deer Hunter. Do you remember that production, Robert? The one where your insistence on authentic emotional experience led you to actually slap Christopher Walken during their Russian roulette scene, without telling him it was coming. The room was completely silent, riveted by this unprecedented public dissection. Christopher was so shaken by your authentic approach that he couldn't continue filming for the rest of that day, but you felt it was worth traumatizing a fellow actor because it served your concept of method truth. Michael turned to face the audience, speaking directly to them now rather than to De Niro. But here's what I find most interesting about tonight's lecture on authentic acting. Robert has spent the last 20 minutes criticizing actors who prioritize charm and professionalism over emotional depth. But let's examine what his method actually produces. Michael's analysis was becoming devastating in its logical progression. Robert's performances are certainly intense, certainly memorable, but are they actually truthful? Or are they elaborate displays of technique designed to impress other actors and critics, rather than to serve the stories being told? Michael's voice grew stronger, more focused. When I watch Robert's work, I often find myself watching Robert De Niro demonstrating his commitment to the role, rather than watching a character living truthfully in the circumstances of the story. The observation was brutal in its accuracy. The weight gain, the accent work, the physical transformation, these are all impressive technical achievements. But they're also barriers between the audience and the character. They're saying, look at how hard I worked, or rather than believe in this person I'm portraying. Michael looked directly at De Niro. You want to know the difference between us, Robert? I've never confused the process with the product. You've become so obsessed with the mechanics of acting that you've forgotten its purpose. Michael's voice grew quieter but somehow more powerful. Acting isn't about suffering. It isn't about transformation for its own sake. It's about telling stories that connect with audiences, creating characters that people can believe in and care about. Michael gestured toward the assembled crowd. Everyone in this room understands that cinema is a collaborative art form, but your approach treats it as a solo exhibition where everyone else exists to support your personal exploration of emotional truth. The room was absolutely silent. You call me a fraud, Robert, but I would suggest that the real fraud is someone who has convinced the industry that self-indulgence equals artistry, that making other people accommodate your process equals dedication, that physical suffering equals emotional truth. Michael's final statement was delivered with devastating calm. I show up prepared. I know my lines. I understand the character and the story. I work collaboratively with directors and fellow actors to serve the film rather than my own ego. and I deliver honest performances that connect with audiences around the world." Michael paused, looking directly at De Niro. "That's not fraud, Robert. That's professionalism. And if you can't tell the difference, perhaps you should reconsider who the real fraud is in this conversation." What happened next shocked everyone in the Grand Palais. Robert De Niro, the most intense and uncompromising actor of his generation, slowly sank to his knees on the stage. "Michael," he said, his voice barely audible, "you're right about all of it." The sight of De Niro on his knees, publicly acknowledging his failures, was something no one in that room would ever forget. "I've become so obsessed with proving my commitment to the craft that I've forgotten what the craft is actually for," De Niro continued, tears visible in his eyes. "I've been indulgent, selfish, cruel to people who were trying to help me create something beautiful." Michael stood quietly, allowing De Niro to continue. "You're right that I traumatized Christopher Walken. You're right that I exhaust people with my demands. You're right that I've confused suffering with truth." De Niro looked up at Michael from his position on the floor. "And you're right that you're a better actor than I am. Not because you work harder, but because you work smarter, because you understand that acting is about serving the story, not serving your own need to prove something." Michael reached down and offered his hand to help De Niro stand. "Get up, Robert," he said quietly. "This isn't necessary." But De Niro remained on his knees. "It is necessary," he said, "because I need everyone in this room to know that what I said about you was wrong, cruel, and born out of my own insecurity about what I've become." Finally, De Niro accepted Michael's hand and stood up. But the damage to his reputation was profound and lasting. The remainder of the evening proceeded in stunned silence. De Niro finished his speech with a subdued apology for his behavior, and the ceremony concluded without any of the celebratory atmosphere that had marked its beginning. In the weeks that followed, the story of Michael's confrontation with De Niro dominated international entertainment media. Critics and industry professionals debated the philosophical implications of their clash, but most agreed that Michael had exposed fundamental flaws in the method acting approach that De Niro represented. More importantly, the incident fundamentally changed how both men were perceived within the industry. Michael's intelligence, professionalism, and dignity under pressure elevated his reputation enormously, leading to offers for more complex and challenging roles. De Niro, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated as the public humiliation exposed not just his professional arrogance, but his capacity for cruelty toward colleagues and collaborators. Michael Caine showed us that night that real artistry isn't about grand gestures and public displays of commitment, wrote influential critic Pauline Kael. It's about consistently doing excellent work with intelligence, preparation, and respect for your collaborators. The confrontation also forced the industry to examine uncomfortable truths about the cult of method acting and the way that artistic reputation could be used to justify unprofessional behavior. Years later, when asked about the incident, Michael reflected on what had motivated his response. "I couldn't let Robert attack not just my work, but my entire approach to the craft, without defending the values I believe in," he said. "Sometimes you have to stand up for professionalism, collaboration, and the idea that making movies should be enjoyable for everyone involved." When Robert De Niro called Michael Caine a fraud in front of 300 people, he thought he was exposing an actor who had succeeded through charm rather than talent. Instead, Michael's response exposed the real fraud as supposedly serious artist who had confused self-indulgence with dedication and cruelty with commitment. The image of De Niro on his knees, apologizing to the man he had tried to destroy, became one of the defining moments in film festival history. It proved that sometimes the most devastating response to an attack isn't anger or retaliation, but simply the truth delivered with intelligence and dignity by someone who has nothing to hide and everything to be proud of. But the full impact of that confrontation at Cannes extended far beyond the immediate shock of seeing De Niro publicly humiliated. The incident fundamentally changed how the international film community understood the relationship between artistic process and professional behavior, between method acting and genuine talent. In the weeks following the festival, industry publications were filled with analysis and debate about the philosophical questions Michael had raised. Had method acting become an excuse for self-indulgent behavior? Was the cult of suffering that surrounded actors like De Niro actually serving the art form, or was it hindering it? Michael Caine forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about what we've been celebrating as artistic excellence, wrote prominent film critic Andrew Sarris in The Village Voice. The question isn't whether De Niro is talented. He obviously is. The question is whether his methods actually serve the stories he's telling, or whether they serve his own need to be seen as serious and committed. The confrontation also sparked a broader discussion about national differences in acting approaches. De Niro represented the American method tradition, with its emphasis on emotional memory, physical transformation, and psychological realism. Michael represented the British classical tradition, with its focus on technique, professionalism, and collaborative storytelling. What we witnessed at Cannes was more than just a personal conflict, observed Royal Shakespeare Company director Trevor Nunn. It was a clash between two fundamental philosophies of what acting should be and how actors should conduct themselves in service of their craft. The immediate professional consequences for both men were dramatic but opposite in direction. Michael found himself inundated with offers from prestigious directors who had been impressed not just by his response to De Niro's attack, but by the intelligence and dignity he had shown under extreme pressure. After Cannes, everyone in the industry understood that Michael Caine was more than just a charming movie star, said director Sidney Lumet, who cast Michael in several films during this period. He had demonstrated intellectual depth, emotional intelligence, and the kind of backbone that you want in a leading man. This led to some of Michael's finest work in the 1980s, including his Academy Award-winning performance in Hannah and Her Sisters, and his acclaimed roles in Educating Rita and The Man Who Would Be King. De Niro, meanwhile, faced a much more difficult path. The public humiliation at Cannes, combined with the exposure of his unprofessional behavior, made studios and directors reluctant to work with him. His reputation for being difficult, which had previously been tolerated because of his talent, now seemed like an unnecessary risk. The industry realized that there were other talented actors who could deliver great performances without putting everyone through emotional torture, explained producer Irwin Winkler, who had worked with both men. Why deal with someone who makes the process miserable when you can get equally good results from someone who's professional and collaborative? The incident also had a profound personal impact on De Niro, who spent months in what friends described as a period of deep self-examination and attempted reform. He enrolled in therapy, began reading books about collaboration and leadership, and made efforts to change his approach to working with other actors and directors. Robert was genuinely shaken by what happened at Cannes, said actress Meryl Streep, who worked with De Niro in the years following the incident. He realized that his behavior had been hurting people, and he was determined to change. It was actually quite moving to see someone with his stature willing to admit he'd been wrong and work to become better. The transformation was gradual but noticeable. De Niro began arriving on sets better prepared, treated crew members with more respect, and made efforts to create collaborative rather than confrontational working environments. But perhaps most importantly, he began to reconsider his approach to the craft itself. Instead of viewing acting as a solitary exploration of personal psychology, he started thinking about it as a collaborative process designed to serve the story and the audience. Michael's criticism forced me to ask myself why I was acting. De Niro said in a 1985 interview with American Film magazine, "Was I trying to prove something about my own emotional depth, or was I trying to create characters that would serve the films I was in? I realized I'd lost sight of the real purpose of the work." This philosophical shift led to some of De Niro's most accessible and emotionally connected performances, including his work in The King of Comedy and later Goodfellas, where his acting served the story rather than drawing attention to itself. The Cannes confrontation also influenced how acting schools and drama programs approached the teaching of method techniques. Educators began emphasizing the importance of professional behavior alongside emotional exploration, and many programs added courses on collaboration and workplace ethics. The De Niro-Caine incident became a cautionary tale that we use to teach young actors about the difference between commitment and self-indulgence, said Stella Adler studio director Tom Oppenheim. Method acting can be a powerful tool, but it should never come at the expense of treating your colleagues with respect. The incident had lasting effects on film festival culture as well. Festival organizers became more careful about monitoring acceptance speeches and presentations, developing protocols to prevent similar incidents from occurring. The Cannes confrontation showed us that we needed to be more proactive about maintaining the dignity and professionalism of our events, said festival director Gilla Jacob. We never wanted to see another honoree use our platform to attack a colleague. The philosophical questions raised by Michael's response also influenced film criticism and academic study of acting. Universities began offering courses that examined different national traditions of performance and the cultural assumptions underlying various approaches to the craft. Michael's defense of professionalism and collaboration challenged the romantic notion that great art requires great suffering, said film studies professor Dr. Janet Maslin. He forced us to consider whether the mythology surrounding method acting was actually serving the art form or hindering it. The personal relationship between Michael and De Niro, surprisingly, gradually improved over the years following the Caine incident. Their mutual respect grew as De Niro demonstrated genuine change in his approach to the craft and his treatment of colleagues. Robert called me about 6 months after Caine, Michael revealed in a 1990 interview. He thanked me for forcing him to confront some uncomfortable truths about his behavior. He said the humiliation had been necessary because he'd become so insulated from criticism that he'd lost perspective on how his actions affected other people. This led to an unexpected friendship and professional collaboration. In 1987, they appeared together in The Good Shepherd, where their on-screen chemistry reflected their newfound mutual respect and understanding. Working with Robert after everything that had happened was fascinating, Michael said. He had become a completely different actor, still intense and committed, but also generous and collaborative. He'd learned to channel his passion in ways that served the story rather than his own ego. The film was praised by critics for the authentic rapport between the two actors, and their collaboration became a symbol of how professional conflicts could be resolved through honest communication and mutual respect. 20 years after the Caine confrontation, both men were interviewed for a documentary about acting techniques and professional relationships in Hollywood. Their reflections revealed how profoundly the incident had affected their understanding of the craft and their approach to their careers. That night at Caine was the most important moment of my professional life, De Niro said in the documentary. Not because I was humiliated, but because Michael forced me to see that I'd confused intensity with truth, suffering with artistry, difficulty with dedication. Michael's perspective was characteristically measured. I didn't set out to humiliate Robert, but I couldn't let his attack on my professionalism go unanswered. The most important thing was that we both learned something from the experience, about acting, about collaboration, and about how we wanted to conduct ourselves in this business. The documentary also featured interviews with directors, fellow actors, and industry professionals who had worked with both men before and after the Caine incident. The consensus was that the confrontation had ultimately benefited both actors and the industry as a whole. Michael's response to Robert's attack became a watershed moment, said director Martin Scorsese. It established new standards for how we think about professionalism, collaboration, and the relationship between artistic commitment and personal behavior. Today, the Caine confrontation is taught in film schools as an example of how philosophical differences about craft can be resolved through honest dialogue and mutual respect. It's also cited in business schools as a case study in conflict resolution and professional development. The legacy of that evening continues to influence how actors approach their craft and their relationships with colleagues. The incident demonstrated that true artistic excellence requires not just talent and dedication, but also the wisdom to channel those qualities in ways that serve the collaborative nature of filmmaking. When Robert De Niro called Michael Caine a fraud in front of 300 people, he thought he was defending the purity of the acting craft against commercial compromise. Instead, he learned that the greatest fraud is using artistic commitment as an excuse for unprofessional behavior, and that true artistry requires not just passion, but also the discipline to use that passion in service of something larger than yourself.